I had no idea my spouse had a stepson that big. I feel deceived. According to my husband, he didn't tell me simply because I didn't ask if he had a stepchild. Furthermore, he and my mother-in-law have been treating me and that child horribly. Just remember, the grudge of the two of us, I will return it 100-fold. My name is Rachel, 42 years old, and I married George, who is a divorcee and 4 years older. Having lost my mother early, I missed marriage opportunities while caring for my father, and a year after his death, a relative introduced me to George. George, looking sincere and good in a suit, confidently led our relationship, and we married 6 months after meeting. His mother was pleased that someone would marry her divorced son, reassured me that there'd be no issues between us. Since George was divorced, we skipped the wedding and reception. We filled our marriage paper at the city hall and had a simple dinner with relatives. When we were back at his family's home, I found teen sneakers. Are these yours? No, they're Charles's. Charles? Who's that? That was when I first learned that George had a son called Charles who was a high school student. He was a child by his ex-wife and she had passed away due to illness when he was 10. His grandparents wanted him, but mother-in-law insisted he stays as George's heir, and he has been living at this house ever since. I wasn't told any of this. Suddenly having a 16-year-old stepson for my first marriage was daunting. But George said, "You didn't ask, Rachel, did you?" Indeed, it wouldn't be strange for a divorcee to have kids. If it's my fault for not asking, perhaps that's true, but shouldn't such things be shared? On the first day of marriage, I already felt distrust towards George. Mother-in-law added, "Don't worry. We'll send Charles away after high school." Does that mean I have to deal with this for more than a year and a half? I was really shocked, but I also felt uneasy about her saying she'd kick him out. To use such words about her grandson, isn't that quite cold? Or is he really such a terrible son? This trouble on day one made me anxious, but I resolved to try. In the end, Charles, who didn't show up for the wedding day meal, emerged from his room the next morning for breakfast. He had the look of a teenager in full rebellion. Not even glancing my way. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm starting to live in this house from today," I said nervously. He just muttered annoying and went back to his room with his slice of toast. I guess this is what they call the rebellious phase, I thought, trying to convince myself that all teenage boys must be like this. But then George and mother-in-law said, "Rachel, you don't need to bother greeting someone like him. Yeah, despite us making sure he goes to school, he's just become more and more of a problem. If he's going to turn out like that, we should never have taken him in." Hearing them speak like that brought back the unease I felt the night before. They say children all grow up the way they are raised, don't they? A child's personality doesn't just get better by going to school. Maybe Charles turned out this way because of you too? As I pondered this, mother-in-law spoke to me. "Rachel, don't worry about Charles. Could you massage my shoulders and back later?" "Ah, yes, of course. As getting older, everything starts to hurt. I'll need you to do this every day from now on." "Every day?" I thought, and George added nonchalantly. "That's great, Mom. Rachel took care of her dad for a long time, so feel free to ask her for help. Really, it saves money, and that's a big help." Their words made it clear to me. George married me to be a caretaker for his mother. I remember how their faces lit up during the first meeting when they heard I'd been caring for my father for nearly 10 years. As I recalled this, my displeasure must have shown because George glanced at me and said, "What's wrong? A woman over 40 getting married should be grateful." I didn't want to hear that from a divorced man over 45. Although I didn't talk back, I was already regretting this marriage. Afterward, George and mother-in-law's true colors became increasingly apparent. George, spoiled by his mother, wouldn't even take his socks out of the dresser himself. It was always Rachel. "Bring them quickly." Really, what a pain. My ex-wife was at least better than this. And he was very cold to Charles. Just seeing him eating in the dining room would prompt George to flip his plate over, saying, "You're in the way, go to your room," or yell at him after seeing his report card, "Aren't you ashamed of these grades? Quit high school and get out of this house." It was emotional and verbal abuse at its worst. Moreover, it seems that when Charles was younger, he even physically hurt him. It had become neighborhood gossip, so thankfully, it seems he hasn't done that recently. Mother-in-law, for her part, would have me massage her multiple times a day because of various pains, and on top of that, she would have me run errands non-stop. She even had the gall to say, "Your father must have pitted having such a failure of a daughter to take care of him." I wanted to leave right then and there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it because of Charles. Living with him, I realized he wasn't a bad kid at heart. Whenever he had laundry, he always made sure to say, "Auntie, here," and after meals, he took his dishes all the way to the sink. At least he was better than George and mother-in-law, who would just leave everything wherever they last used it. Once, I saw him with a girl who looked to be his girlfriend. Charles had all the buttons of his clothes undone, and underneath was a worn-out t-shirt, looking very much like a delinquent. But the girl was properly dressed in her clothes, not too short skirt, a very pretty and neat-looking girl. And when Charles noticed me, he said something to her, and she smiled and nodded to me. Charles, it seemed, didn't hate me, and choosing such a polite girl suggested he was at heart very earnest and kind. It made me very happy. All right, I thought, I'll protect this boy from George and mother-in-law until he gets married. I made up my mind to support him. From then on, I kept healthy distance with Charles, slowly becoming friendlier. I made his favorite meals and gave him nice sneakers for his birthday. Once, when he was down about bad test scores, I confessed my own worst grades from when I was a student. "You're just as dumb as me," he'd laugh, and it made me so happy. However, as I grew closer to Charles, George and mother-in-law's behavior toward me worsened. "When thinking about you, Rachel, you're over 40, right? That means you can't have George's children. We'll need you for caregiving, but maybe George needs another woman, huh? I recently met this young and pretty bar girl. When I told her I was married, she was shocked, so maybe I'll have her bear my child." That they could say such things to me, even half-jokingly, shows they really only see me as a housekeeper or a caregiver. Well, that's fine, it's actually more convenient for me. Yes, I'm terribly sorry for being such an incompetent wife, unable to bear cute grandchildren that resemble George, I said meekly, apologizing. For years later, Charles turned 20 and was set to marry that young lady from back then. Hearing they didn't have much money as both were high school graduates, I gave my savings of $10,000 from my single years. I also rented out the restaurant where she worked and invited many guests, mainly former classmates, for a lively wedding reception. I prepared a surprise gift for Charles, which he was delighted with. Of course, George and mother-in-law were not invited. Good, my role is over. I thought to myself as I headed home, only to be called into the living room by my husband, where mother-in-law was smirking. George handed me the divorce paper that was on the table, saying, "Thanks for the hard work, housekeeper. Now that Charles is gone, you're no longer needed, so let's get divorced." Wait, what about taking care of mother-in-law? I was surprised as I had planned to bring up divorce myself. Actually, I picked up the divorce paper today from the city hall. Did you know? You can't ask for a divorce if you're the one at fault. George and mother-in-law looked shocked. Not having considered that I wanted a divorce, especially that they could be responsible. George turned red and yelled, "You have no right to ask for a divorce. You can't have children, you can't even take care of my mother properly, it's all your fault." Mother-in-law agreed. Exactly. We took you in even though you were past your prime, and ever since you came, my health has gone downhill. Mother, all you do is give orders and lie in bed all day. I think that's why your health has deteriorated. I retorted, and she fell silent. I've endured the last 4 years, putting up with trash like you too. I'll tell you why I've been so patient. Trash? How dare you? I told them that I had tolerated everything until now just to help Charles, who had been ignored and treated harshly in this house. Now that Charles got married today, there's no reason for me to stay married, so I asked for a divorce. George snorted in derision. You're an idiot. Even if you got on Charles's good side, you won't get a dime of assets from us. You should have been more devoted to us instead of him. I laughed back at him. What assets? There's hardly any left. Your father gambled it all away, I heard from the neighbors. Debt collectors came by many times. George was surprised I knew, but retorted, "We still have this house. If you stayed married to me, you could have lived here for life." I've seen termites flying around the house lately. I heard if you see one, there are 30,000 hidden. This house is in a pretty bad state. I don't want such house. They were silent, so I went on the offensive. "Let me say this, Mother, you've been talking about how your health is getting worse, haven't you? I don't want to take care of an old woman like you. In 10 years, George will be retired. You expect me to take care of him for the rest of his life? That's a joke. Besides, I heard his company's performance is terrible. If it keeps up, there won't be much retirement money, right? Living with you sounds like a very poor old age." George, thinking he had a trump card, blurted out. "Anyway, we're getting divorced. And I'm going to make sure I get my share of the property." "Huh? I know you inherited several $100,000 from your father's estate. And there was life insurance money too. I'm going to use that to put my mother in a fancy nursing home." Mother-in-law nodded in satisfaction at her side. "Oh, that's why they said I was no longer needed even though mother-in-law's care was still an issue." I couldn't help but laugh. You know, property division is about splitting the assets that the couple built together. George and mother-in-law seemed confused, so I explained further. "That means, neither my father's inheritance nor the life insurance payout are included since they weren't built together by us as a couple. Sorry to burst your bubble." Hearing this, they looked bewildered, finally realizing they were in a weaker position. "Rachel, don't you think we need to talk more about this?" Mother-in-law suggested timidly, with George nodding vigorously beside her. "No, thank you. I'll go ahead with the divorce." I thrust the divorce paper I had obtained at George. "I have plenty of recordings of the abusive things you two have said to me and Charles. If we go to court, you'll definitely lose." After I said that, George, looking like he had swallowed a bitter bug, reluctantly signed the divorce paper. "As for the divorce settlement and property division, I've got a lawyer, so from now on, you can deal with him," I added. I handed them the lawyer's business card, and they seemed to resign themselves to the situation. "That's it, right?" "Not so fast, there's more. In fact, Charles's deceased mother's parents are also planning to sue you for damages." "What?" When there was a Charles's wedding, I had hired a private investigator to find his maternal grandparents and invited them as a surprise. According to Charles's grandparents, after his mother passed away, George and he moved to George's parents' home. They weren't informed of the new address, so they lost contact with Charles. When Charles and his grandparents, who hadn't seen each other for 10 years, met, they hugged and cried together. After hearing about the mistreatment and verbal abuse toward Charles from George and mother-in-law, his grandparents decided to hire a competent lawyer to pursue the case thoroughly. George and mother-in-law were shocked by this revelation. I delivered the final blow to them. "Mother, please find George a young, healthy woman who can bear children." "But, do you really think any woman would want to marry a twice-divorced, over 50-year-old man with no real assets and a hint of old age?" After I left, I heard that they became quite troubled. Mother-in-law became immobile due to a lack of exercise, and without the possibility of a fancy nursing home, she had to hire a helper reluctantly. With the payments for my settlement, George was drowning in debt. Moreover, the house had become a dirty home, shunned by neighbors due to the termites. Despite all this, George proposed to that bar girl he'd been seeing for 4 years, which is quite something. Of course, she turned him down immediately. Afterward, I moved back to my family home for a while to relax. Later, by the recommendation of Charles and his wife, I rented a place near their apartment. They actually offered for me to live with them, but I couldn't impose on my stepson and his new bride. Now, I work part-time at a nearby supermarket, looking forward to meeting their child expected next year.